Conspiracy theories are cheap. They live on message boards. They spread through comment sections. And they die the same way they were born, without evidence, without documentation, without a single name willing to stand behind them in daylight. Every iconic death in rock history has its own constellation of theories. Jim Morrison faked it. John Lennon's murder was orchestrated. Tupac is alive somewhere. And Kurt Cobain was murdered. For 30 years, that last claim circulated through the same underground channels as all the others. Fan forums, Reddit threads, self-published books sold at record fairs, documentaries with dramatic reenactments and anonymous sources. The problem was always the same problem. No institutional weight. Nobody who had actually sat in that room, held that evidence, read those files from beginning to end, was willing to say what the forums were saying. Until now. Because the man who is speaking in 2024 is not a conspiracy theorist. He is not a true crime podcaster with a Patreon account and a ring light. He is not a former bandmate processing grief through accusation. He is Neil Lowe, and Neil Lowe spent 50 years inside the same institution that closed this case. The weight of a badge. Neil Lowe joined the Seattle Police Department to understand what that means. Consider the timeline. In 1968, Kurt Cobain was 1 year old. Lowe was already building a career that would span 5 decades, work through hundreds of violent crime investigations, and accumulate the kind of institutional knowledge that cannot be replicated in a classroom or a podcast studio. By the time Cobain died in April 1994, Lowe was a seasoned veteran of the department's Violent Crimes Division, the division responsible for investigating exactly the kind of scene that was discovered at the Lake Washington Boulevard house on the morning of April 8th. Lowe was not a peripheral figure in Seattle law enforcement. He was not someone who heard about the case secondhand or read about it in the newspaper. He was a commander in the division that should have treated that greenhouse as a potential crime scene from the first moment a detective crossed the threshold. And in 2005, 11 years after the official conclusion was stamped onto the file, Lowe's own police chief gave him a specific assignment: go back to the Cobain investigation and conduct an internal audit, review everything. That assignment gave Lowe something that no conspiracy theorist, no documentarian, no journalist had ever been given: full access. What full access actually means. When Neil Lowe says he reviewed the Cobain case, he is not describing what most people mean when they use that phrase. He is not describing a review of publicly released documents. He is not describing an analysis of photographs that circulated online or police reports that were partially declassified in Full access meant Lowe physically held the shotgun. He sat with the suicide note in front of him and read it as an investigator, not as a grieving fan. He went through every photograph in the archive, not the photographs that were released to the public, but every photograph taken at the scene. He reviewed every report filed by every officer who entered that house. He read the statements. He examined the toxicology documentation. He looked at the timeline of the investigation with the specific trained eye of someone who had spent decades understanding how violent crime investigations are supposed to unfold, and recognizing when they do not. This is a critical distinction, because what Lowe found was not a single smoking gun. What he found was a pattern of decisions, assumptions, and procedural failures that, in his professional judgment, compromised the integrity of the entire investigation from its earliest moments. And in 2024, in an exclusive interview with the Daily Mail, Lowe decided to say what he found out loud for the first time: the announcement before the examination. The first problem Lowe identifies is the one that, in his view, corrupted everything that came after. On the morning of April 8, 1994, while the medical examiner was still inside the greenhouse processing the scene, a Seattle Police Department spokesperson stepped outside and told the gathered press that Kurt Cobain had died by suicide. The investigation was not complete. The medical examiner had not issued findings. The scene had not been fully processed, and yet the official conclusion was already being stated publicly, on record, to journalists who would broadcast it to the world within hours. Lowe's argument is straightforward. Once that announcement was made, the investigative framework was set. The detectives who then worked the scene were not approaching it as an open case with an unknown cause of death. They were documenting a suicide. The entire orientation of the investigation shifted from question to confirmation. In Lowe's experience, this kind of premature conclusion is exactly how critical evidence gets missed, how contradictory details get explained away rather than examined, and how a scene that should be treated as a potential homicide never receives the scrutiny it deserves. He does not frame this as deliberate misconduct. He frames it as a catastrophic procedural failure, one that made every subsequent step in the investigation less reliable than it should have been. The heroin question and the physics of the scene. The second issue Lowe raises is one that has circulated in Cobain discussions for decades, but gains a different quality when it comes from someone with Lowe's background. The toxicology report from April 1994 showed that Cobain had approximately 1.52 milligrams of heroin per liter of blood in his system at the time of death. To put that in context, the threshold considered lethal for a non-tolerant individual is typically around 0.5 milligrams per liter. Even accounting for Cobain's documented history of heavy heroin use and the tolerance that long-term use develops, the level found in his system was, by most medical assessments, extraordinarily high, roughly 3 times what would be considered a fatal dose for a typical user. The question that Lowe, like many others before him, cannot resolve is a physical one. At that level of opioid saturation, the body's motor functions are severely compromised. The muscles relax, coordination degrades, the ability to perform complex, coordinated physical actions, like loading a weapon, positioning it, and operating the trigger mechanism, becomes extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. Lowe's position is not that it is definitively impossible. His position is that, given the concentration documented in the toxicology report, the possibility of external assistance in the final moments deserves serious investigative consideration. Consideration that, in his view, the original investigation never meaningfully provided. The hands. Of all the details Lowe raises, the one that stopped him most directly when he reviewed the evidence in 2005 was the condition of Cobain's hands. In the crime scene photographs, the full archive, not the publicly circulated images, Lowe examined the state of Cobain's hands with the attention of someone who had spent decades at violent crime scenes and understood what physical evidence is supposed to look like in a death of this nature. A shotgun discharge of the caliber involved, fired at close range to the head, produces significant physical transfer. Blood, tissue, and particulate matter travel backward along the path of force and deposit on the hands, the forearms, and the surrounding area. This is not a controversial point in forensic pathology. It is a documented, consistent pattern across thousands of cases. What Lowe says he saw in those photographs was inconsistent with that pattern. The hands were, in his assessment, unusually clean, not entirely free of any material, but lacking the degree and distribution of transfer that the nature of the wound should have produced. Lowe does not present this as absolute proof of anything. He presents it as one more data point in a collection of data points that, taken together, he could not reconcile with the official conclusion. A trained investigator looking at those hands, he argues, should have asked a question. He is not certain that question was ever formally asked. The missing taxi report. Beyond the physical evidence, Lowe points to a documentary anomaly that he finds deeply troubling. In 1994, a report was filed regarding a taxi driver who stated that he had picked up a passenger from the vicinity of the Cobain residence, a passenger who did not match Cobain's description. This detail, if accurate, would be significant. It would suggest the presence of at least one other individual near the scene in a time frame relevant to the investigation. In the original 1994 documentation, this report exists. When the Seattle Police Department released a larger set of case documents in 2014, in response to ongoing public interest and media requests, that report was not included. Lowe's position is direct. The absence of that report from the 2014 release is not something he can explain as routine administrative editing. He also notes similar gaps around the documentation of where and how the ammunition found at the scene was purchased, a detail that in any homicide investigation would be treated as a basic evidentiary thread requiring full documentation. These are not accusations of deliberate cover-up. Lowe is careful about that, but he is also clear that missing documentation in a violent death case is never a trivial matter, and that the pattern of what is absent from the record is, in his view, as significant as what is present. The institutional standoff. What makes Neil Lowe's position uniquely uncomfortable? For the department, for the official record, and for anyone who has spent 30 years accepting the standard narrative, is that he cannot be dismissed the way every previous voice on this subject has been dismissed. The Seattle Police Department responded to his claims with a single unambiguous statement. Kurt Cobain died by suicide in 1994, and this continues to be the department's position. That response is institutional and absolute. It does not engage with Lowe's specific points. It does not address the premature announcement, the toxicology questions, the condition of the hands, or the missing taxi report. It simply restates the conclusion. But here is the problem that statement cannot resolve. The man challenging that conclusion spent 50 years inside that institution. He was given full access to the case by that institution's own leadership. He is not an outsider pushing against a closed door. He is someone who was handed the key, walked through the door, looked at what was inside, and came out saying the official story does not hold. That is a different kind of challenge than anything this case has seen in the 30 years since that greenhouse door was opened on the morning of April 8th, and it demands a different kind of answer than a press statement.